Happening, the FBI announcing indictments against 20 people, including 14 current and former Mississippi and Tennessee police officers in a drug-related bribery probe.
We have permanently removed a drug trafficking organization out of the streets of Philadelphia, and they're going to stop pouring guns and chemicals and drugs into our communities, and our children are safer today.
The bust happened in the area of Clearfield and F Streets. Our Chris O'Connell has been following this story since it broke this morning. And Chris, this could change everything.
The unmarked sedan pulled into the driveway at exactly 5:47 in the morning. Special Agent Marcus Chen had been awake for 23 hours straight, running on black coffee and the kind of adrenaline that only comes when you're about to take down someone who thought they were untouchable. Through the windshield, he could see the house, a sprawling estate in Scottsdale that sat behind iron gates and manicured hedges. The kind of place that screamed success, respectability, power. The kind of place a corrupt judge buys with blood money. Judge Vincent Holloway had served on the Superior Court of Maricopa County for 14 years. During that time, he'd built a reputation as tough but fair, a no-nonsense jurist who didn't tolerate games in his courtroom. Legal journals had profiled him. Law students studied his rulings. The governor had twice considered him for the state Supreme Court. But Chen knew the truth now, and the truth was ugly enough to make his stomach turn. Holloway wasn't administering justice. He was selling it, case by case, defendant by defendant, to the highest bidder. The investigation had started 22 months ago when a mid-level trafficker named Eduardo Vega got arrested with 47 kilos of methamphetamine in a hidden compartment beneath his truck. Vega was looking at 25 to life under federal sentencing guidelines. He had priors. He had connections to a major distribution network operating out of Sonora. He should have been going away forever. Instead, his case got kicked down to state court on a technicality, landed in front of Judge Holloway, and within 6 weeks, Vega walked out of the courtroom with time served and probation. The charges had been reduced to simple possession. The evidence had been excluded on grounds so flimsy that even Vega's own attorney looked shocked. The federal prosecutor on the case, Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Moreno, had called Chen's office the same day. She was furious, claiming the ruling made no legal sense whatsoever. Chen had brushed it off initially as just another frustrated prosecutor upset about losing a case, but Moreno was persistent. She started sending him case files, patterns, data. Over the next 3 months, she documented 19 separate cases in Holloway's courtroom, where defendants with cartel connections had received outcomes that defied explanation. Charges dismissed on technicalities. Evidence excluded despite clear admissibility. Sentences so light they bordered on absurd. Chen started digging. He pulled Holloway's financial records through a subpoena disguised as part of an unrelated money laundering investigation. What he found made everything click into place. Holloway earned $173,000 annually as a judge. Respectable, comfortable, but not extravagant. Yet his bank records showed purchases and transactions that told a very different story. A lake house in Sedona worth $850,000, paid in cash. A Mercedes S-Class purchased outright for $92,000. Luxury vacations to Cabo San Lucas, the Cayman Islands, Dubai. Deposits into offshore accounts. Purchases of gold and cryptocurrency. When Chen's forensic accountants finished their analysis, they estimated Holloway had spent approximately $3.2 million over the past 7 years on assets and expenditures that couldn't be explained by his legitimate income. But having unexplained wealth wasn't enough to prove corruption. Chen needed evidence that Holloway was making corrupt rulings in exchange for payments. That meant going deeper, getting closer, taking risks. The FBI brought in a confidential informant, a lawyer named Daniel Ortega, who'd been arrested on unrelated fraud charges and was desperate to cut a deal. Ortega had connections in the legal community, and more importantly, he had a relationship with one of the intermediaries who'd been funneling money to Holloway. Chen's team wired Ortega up and sent him into meetings with both the intermediary and eventually with Holloway himself. The recordings were damning. In one conversation, captured on March 15th of last year, Holloway and the intermediary discussed an upcoming case involving a defendant named Luis Campos, who'd been arrested with 83 pounds of fentanyl. The intermediary, speaking carefully but clearly, asked what it would cost to ensure Campos didn't go to prison. Holloway's response was chilling in its casualness. He quoted a price of $75,000 and explained exactly how he'd structure the ruling to make it look legitimate. He'd exclude the evidence based on an illegal search claim, then dismiss the case when the prosecution couldn't proceed. 2 weeks later, that's exactly what happened. Campos walked free, and Holloway's offshore account received a deposit of $75,000 from a shell company registered in Panama. Chen didn't stop with Holloway. The more he dug, the more he realized this wasn't one corrupt judge operating alone. Holloway had built a network. He'd recruited other judges, prosecutors, even a few defense attorneys who played specific roles in the scheme. There was Judge Sarah Pennington in Pima County, who handled 43 cases over 5 years, where cartel-connected defendants received favorable treatment. There was Judge Marcus Webb in Yavapai County, who specialized in reducing charges on weapons trafficking cases. There was District Court Judge Angela Torres in New Mexico, who'd been dismissing cases on procedural grounds at a rate that was statistically impossible to explain through legitimate judicial discretion. The network operated with shocking efficiency. When a cartel member or associate got arrested, their attorney would immediately reach out to one of several intermediaries who served as brokers between the criminal organizations and the corrupt judges. These intermediaries, mostly lawyers or business consultants with legitimate practices, would assess the case, determine which judge could help, and negotiate a price. Payments ranged from $25,000 for minor cases up to $200,000 for serious felonies, where the defendant faced decades in prison. The money moved through a complex web of shell companies, offshore accounts, cash payments, and property transfers designed to make tracking nearly impossible. Chen's team identified 11 judges across 3 states who appeared to be part of Holloway's corruption network. They'd collectively handled approximately 870 cases over 7 years, where the outcomes suggested corruption rather than legitimate judicial discretion. The financial analysis showed these judges had received an estimated $42 million in bribes during that period. That number represented thousands of victims denied justice, hundreds of dangerous criminals walking free, and entire communities left vulnerable to violence and addiction because the people sworn to protect them had been bought. The investigation expanded to include wiretaps on 17 phones, surveillance on 43 individuals, and cooperation from 6 confidential informants embedded in various parts of the network. Chen's team worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, building an airtight case. They couldn't afford mistakes. Defense attorneys would scrutinize every warrant, every wiretap authorization, every piece of evidence. The slightest procedural error could tank the entire prosecution. By December, Chen had everything he needed. The evidence filled 632 boxes. The indictment ran 218 pages and detailed specific instances of bribery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, money laundering, and racketeering. The decision was made to arrest all 11 judges simultaneously to prevent anyone from fleeing or destroying evidence. The operation was designated Operation Broken Gavel, and it would require coordination between FBI field offices in Phoenix, Albuquerque, and El Paso, plus support from U.S. Marshals, DEA, and local agencies that hadn't been compromised. Now, sitting in the pre-dawn darkness outside Holloway's house, Chen watched as tactical teams moved into position around the property. There were 8 agents assigned to Holloway alone, plus 4 more blocking the street in case he tried to run. Simultaneously, in 10 other locations across the Southwest, similar teams were preparing to arrest the other judges. The timing had to be perfect. If word got out that one judge had been arrested, the others might disappear. Chen's radio crackled. The voice of the operation commander came through, calm and professional. All teams were in position. All targets were confirmed to be at their residences. The operation was green-lit. Chen stepped out of the sedan and walked toward Holloway's front door. The sun was just beginning to lighten the eastern horizon. In 47 minutes, every one of these corrupt judges would be in federal custody. In the coming months, they'd face trial, conviction, and prison sentences that would ensure they never wore a robe again. But as Chen raised his hand to knock on that heavy wooden door, he thought about all the cases that had been corrupted, all the victims who'd been denied justice, all the criminals who'd walked free because someone with power had decided money was more important than the law. He thought about Eduardo Vega, who'd overdosed 3 months after his release and taken 2 teenagers with him when the drugs he was selling turned out to be laced with pure fentanyl. He thought about Luis Campos, who'd been arrested again 6 weeks ago with enough fentanyl to kill 50,000 people. He thought about all the families destroyed, all the communities devastated, all because judges who were supposed to be guardians of justice had become partners with the very criminals they were supposed to stop. The door opened. Judge Vincent Holloway stood there in a bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, looking confused and annoyed at being disturbed so early. Chen held up his credentials and spoke the words he'd been waiting 22 months to say. Judge Holloway, I'm Special Agent Marcus Chen with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Holloway's face went pale. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the marble floor. Chen continued, reciting the Miranda rights from memory while agents moved past him into the house to begin the search. By 7:15 that morning, all 11 judges were in custody. By 9:30, the arrests were being announced at simultaneous press conferences in Phoenix, Albuquerque, and El Paso. The media coverage was immediate and intense. Largest judicial corruption case in decades screamed the headlines. 11 judges arrested in cartel bribery scheme, declared the cable news chyrons. Legal experts called it unprecedented. Civil rights advocates called it a betrayal. Victims' families called it long overdue. The judges' attorneys immediately began crafting defenses, claiming prosecutorial overreach, arguing entrapment, challenging the wiretap authorizations. But Chen knew the evidence was solid. The recordings were clear. The financial records were irrefutable. The testimony from cooperating witnesses was devastating. 3 of the judges agreed to plea deals within the first month, hoping to reduce their sentences by cooperating against the others. They provided additional details about how the network operated, identified more intermediaries, and confirmed that cartel representatives had actively recruited them. One of them, Judge Sarah Pennington, broke down during her proffer session and admitted she'd started taking bribes because of gambling debts, but had continued because she convinced herself that the defendants were going to get good lawyers anyway. So what difference did it make? Chen had no sympathy. The difference was that those defendants should have been convicted based on the evidence and the law, not set free because someone paid for it. The trials began 9 months after the arrests. Judge Holloway's case went first. The prosecution presented 37 recorded conversations, 14 financial transactions directly linking payments to specific case outcomes, and testimony from 4 cooperating witnesses who detailed exactly how the scheme worked. The defense argued that Holloway had made legitimate rulings that happened to benefit defendants, and that his wealth came from investments and family money. The jury didn't buy it. After 6 days of deliberations, they returned guilty verdicts on 23 of 27 counts. Holloway was sentenced to 34 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. He was 61 years old. He would die behind bars. The other judges received similar sentences, ranging from 18 years to 42 years, depending on their level of involvement and the number of cases they'd corrupted. The intermediaries got between 10 and 25 years. The defense attorneys who'd participated in the scheme were disbarred and sentenced to prison terms averaging 12 years. In total, 37 people connected to the corruption network were convicted and imprisoned. But the damage couldn't be undone. 870 cases had to be reviewed by a special task force of prosecutors brought in from outside the affected jurisdictions. In some cases, charges were refiled and defendants were retried. In others, too much time had passed, witnesses had disappeared, evidence had been lost. 214 defendants who should have been in prison were never successfully re-prosecuted. They remained free, their cases permanently tainted by the corruption that had infected the system. The institutional impact was equally severe. Public trust in the judiciary plummeted. Defense attorneys routinely filed motions questioning whether their clients could get fair trials in jurisdictions where corruption had been exposed. Prosecutors struggled to rebuild credibility. Victims' advocates demanded reforms, transparency, oversight. State legislatures passed new laws requiring financial disclosure from judges, creating independent ethics commissions, implementing random case audits. The American Bar Association launched a comprehensive review of judicial ethics and corruption prevention. For Chen, the case became the defining work of his career. He was promoted to Assistant Special Agent in charge and put in command of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit for the entire Southwest region. But the victory felt hollow. Yes, they'd taken down 11 corrupt judges and dismantled a network that had operated for 7 years. Yes, they'd sent a message that no one was above the law, but 870 cases had been corrupted. Hundreds of dangerous criminals had walked free. Countless victims had been denied justice. And for what? So judges who already had comfortable lives could buy vacation homes and luxury cars? Late at night, when Chen reviewed the case files, he kept coming back to one question that he couldn't answer. How many other networks like this were still operating, still undetected, still corrupting the system? Holloway's network had only been discovered because one prosecutor got suspicious and pushed hard enough that someone finally listened. How many suspicious patterns were being ignored right now? How many corrupt judges were making rulings this very moment that betrayed everything the justice system was supposed to represent? The investigation had revealed something darker than individual corruption. It had revealed a vulnerability in the system itself, a space where enormous discretion met limited oversight and created opportunities for betrayal. Judges needed discretion to do their jobs effectively, but that same discretion made it nearly impossible to detect corruption until the pattern became overwhelming. By the time anyone noticed, hundreds of cases had already been compromised. Chen thought about the cartel representatives who'd built this network, who'd identified vulnerable judges and methodically recruited them. They'd understood something important. Controlling the courtroom was more valuable than controlling the streets. You could arrest all the dealers you wanted, seize all the drugs you could find, but if judges were dismissing cases and reducing charges, none of it mattered. The organization would just send more dealers, move more drugs, and the cycle would continue. Corrupting 11 judges for $42 million over 7 years was a bargain compared to the billions those judges helped protect. The final cost of Operation Broken Gavel was difficult to calculate. There was the financial cost, $17 million spent on the investigation, plus hundreds of millions more spent reviewing corrupted cases and attempting to re-prosecute defendants. There was the human cost. Families who'd lost loved ones to violence and addiction, while the people responsible walked free because a judge had been paid off. There was the institutional cost, the erosion of trust in courts, in law enforcement, in justice itself. Chen kept a photograph on his desk from the morning of the arrests. It showed Holloway in handcuffs, being walked to a federal vehicle, his face a mixture of shock and resignation. Chen looked at that photograph every day as a reminder of what the case had been about. Not statistics, not headlines, not career advancement. It was about accountability. It was about the principle that no one, regardless of power or position, should be able to sell justice to criminals and escape consequences. Operation Broken Gavel closed with 11 convictions, 37 total defendants imprisoned, and systemic reforms implemented across 3 states. But for Chen, the work wasn't finished. Somewhere out there, another corrupt official was making another corrupt decision. Another victim was being denied justice. Another criminal was walking free because someone had been paid to look the other way. The fight against corruption didn't end with arrests or convictions. It was ongoing, relentless, necessary. And Chen would keep fighting it for as long as he wore the badge.